Well, hello there and good afternoon. Welcome once again to our Ukraine war question and answer session with the indomitable Professor Michael Clarke. Professor Clarke, great to have you as always. Good afternoon to you. Hope you are well. Thank you all for submitting your questions as always. We've got a great list here of wonderings that the Professor is going to answer. And of course, as always, if you'd like to ask questions as we're going along, please submit them either in the blog or in the YouTube channel in the comments, and we'll try and get to them if we can. We're talking, Professor Clarke, a moment once again after the words of Donald J. Trump have kind of taken us in a slightly different direction, rhetorically at least. We'll see whether or not it has a true effect on the battlefield. And let's start off with the first question here. It's about Trump's perceived U-turn. It comes from Hubbard. I think I've got that right. It said, what's your reading of Trump's U-turn? Tactic, real change in policy, or just another utterance that he'll change his mind on in a few days' time? And if you guys haven't seen what Donald Trump has said, he's essentially given his, it's the most full-throated backing I've heard him give to Ukraine since he came back to office.
Since before, when he was on the campaign trail. He's always maintained the view that Ukraine can't win this war. And he said, that famous meeting in the Oval Office with Zelenskyy when him and J.D. Vance beat up Zelenskyy effectively, 28th of February. And he said, you have no cards. There's no cards you can play, so you're going to lose this war. And that was exactly what Moscow wanted to hear. And what he's now saying is not exactly the opposite of it, but he's saying that he's very impressed by the Ukrainian military. He says they're doing incredibly well. He said that the Russians are a paper tiger, that their military is stretched, which is, they're not a paper tiger, but their military is stretched. Mm-hmm. And that he then says the Russian economy is in terrible, terrible shape. And again, the Russian economy is not in terrible shape, but it is certainly straining, and it will carry on straining. So rhetorically, he's gone to the other extreme. And he said there's no reason, and he said this on Truth Social, it wasn't an answer to a question posed by a reporter. He said on Truth Social that Ukraine could recover all of its territory back to 1991. Why not, he said. But this is the critical thing, which a lot of people don't seem to have picked up yet. At the very end of his post at Truth Social, he said, I wish them both well. Good luck to all.
He can't
that's
help
like
himself.
Waving goodbye, say, I'm off. You and I have talked before that Trump is on a zigzag course out of this war, and I think that's exactly what's happening. And the question is two questions that we've always brought up. One is, who does he blame for the failure of the idea of a peace talks or peace conference? And secondly, would the United States continue some form of help to Ukraine if it withdraws from active support? And what may be important about this statement of him yesterday, I think he is on his way out of the war, but he does now seem to be blaming Putin more than Ukraine for the situation that they're now in, which is only common sense to the rest of us, to be honest. And secondly, there are quite a lot of indications that the United States would continue to provide minimal levels of aid, that is, intelligence and targeting material, because they collect it anyway. They're not doing anything special. They collect all of that stuff for their own purposes. It costs them nothing to share it with the Ukrainians. So it looks as if they would continue to do that. And they're looking at the end of this month, a Ukrainian delegation is due in Washington to talk to American industrialists about joint production. So the Americans are getting interested in helping the Ukrainians scale up their innovative production for war materials, because they know how to do it. They just can't scale it up. They don't have the money to scale it up. And a lot of American entrepreneurs are getting interested in that. And that, again, is a way in which the United States, having withdrawn from active participation, may nevertheless help Ukraine to help itself. So this statement yesterday is rhetorically astonishing. At root, it means, I think, two things. One is he's leaving the war, and will quite soon. But two, he's not blaming Ukraine, and there will be probably a minimal level of American support for the continuation if the Europeans step up, as they say they will. They haven't yet, but they are ramping up, but they'll need to ramp up a fair bit more.
Yep. Rhetorically, as you point out, Michael, it is quite the change, isn't it? And it's probably got Trump to exactly where he wants the US to be. President Biden was giving arms. It was a donation, and Trump, we remember, famously said it was absurd that arms were being given away and the Americans were getting nothing back. Now we have this PEARL, the prioritized Ukraine requirements list, which allows European nations, allied nations, to buy American arms and then give them to Ukraine, which I think Trump is kind of happy with. It's interesting as well that there is that sort of perhaps collaboration coming with US arms manufacturers as well, which will help the US economy. So Trump's kind of getting what he wants. In that regard.
It's a win-win. I mean, again, Trump always said that we've given $350 billion to Ukraine, which was never true. It was $120 billion at most, and 90% of that 120 billion never left the United States. It was all spent inside the United States on weapons, on war production for Ukraine. And it was keeping, last time I looked, it was keeping going 114 different lines of production, which otherwise might have run down or closed, were being kept up by producing stuff for Ukraine or producing stuff to replenish American stocks that had been given to Ukraine. That was the way it worked. So it was about 120 billion, not 350 billion. And the United States has now said, or it seems to be saying, well, we'll sell you these weapons. We won't give them to you. We'll sell them to you. That's not entirely straightforward because Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon, for his own reasons, seems to be saying, well, we can't because we simply can't do this because we need these weapons for our own stocks because we've run down so much. On the other hand, he doesn't apply that argument for weapons going to Israel, only when they go to Ukraine. I still can't get to the bottom of Elbridge Colby's hostility towards Ukraine and his apparent determination that Ukraine should lose more than they've lost so far. But there it is. Trump is not in full control of what goes on in the States because he dips in and out of issues. And lots of things happen because his people make them happen, and then he's kind of bounced into justifying these things. Occasionally he reverses them, but generally speaking, he's bounced into agreeing to things that he didn't really understand the importance of.
Just the last point made by Hubbard here about changing his mind. With what we've said, with the fact that it seems to have got to a point where Trump is getting his arms paid for, he's not having to donate anything. He has, rhetorically at least, backed Ukraine, so his allies will be happy with that.
Yeah.
I mean, him changing his mind on that would be a complete reversal. Probably doesn't want to be made to look more foolish. So do you think we can rely that this is where we are drawn that baseline? He's withdrawing, but this is the position.
There was a rather surprisingly humble statement from him. I don't know if he meant it humbly, but that's how it came over. In response to reporters' questions, said, do you trust Putin? And he said, as always, I'll know in about a month. He always says that. We'll know in 2 weeks. We'll know in a month.
Put it off.
But then he also said, I thought I had a good relationship with Putin. And then he said, but it turns out that relationship didn't count for anything.
It's fascinating, that.
And that's a very honest, rather humiliating statement. Mr. Trump, we could have told you that, back in November, but the pennies dropped, for good for you. It's very curious. And in a way, maybe he is a little bit chastened by the fact that these personal relationships, which he thinks are so strong because he does everything through personal relationships, that his experience is showing him that personal relationships, they are important in politics, but they only go so far.
Or with certain people.
Yeah, and if you're up against a Putin, or a Netanyahu for that matter, who are very, very experienced at manipulating people, particularly in the States, then you'll end up getting bounced into what they want you to do. And so, here we are. Maybe this is a sea change in his attitude to Russia and Putin. It may be. And the Russians, I think, will be quite worried about this. And their statements this morning have been to the effect of, oh, well, this is President Trump being unpredictable. We still think that the normalization process is going more slowly than we wanted. Now, normalization was something that was never possible under the Biden administration because Russia was a pariah because of what they'd done in Ukraine. And it's the Trump administration that said, we want to normalize relations with Russia. Music to the ears of the Kremlin. But the Kremlin are now still on the tack that, yes, we can normalize relations. This is a bit of a setback, but nevertheless, President Trump says what he says. And I'm sure they'll be thinking, look, the next time we can engineer a summit between President Putin and President Trump, he'll be back on our side of the fence because they think that they can manipulate what he says according to, how they react to him on any given weekend.
It's incredible. It remains to be seen as well. And we've got another deadline now looming in a month's time when he's going to see how he feels about Putin. It's absurd.
Yes, right. I'm not going to mark that one in my diary.
I was going to say, I'm not putting that one as a calendar alert to remind me. All right, question here from Janine. It's about that part in his Truth Social. He says that Ukraine can get back its territory. Janine asks, what would it take for Ukraine to be able to retake all of its land and restore its pre-war borders?
A great deal if we're talking about all of its pre-war borders, because you're talking there about Crimea. And for all sorts of reasons, both military and political, Crimea is a really tough nut. I mean, arguably, it was a sort of an anomalous part of Ukraine in 1991 because it was thoroughly Russian and had been in history and was given to Ukraine by in the Stalin-Khrushchev period, in effect, in the 1950s, and it didn't sit very happily there. So Crimea will always be a bit of a problem. If you take that out of the reckoning, could Ukraine get back the territory that it's lost since 2022? And the answer is it could, in theory, if it had the right equipment, if it had enough ammunition and enough European support and the money, if it had the Russian reserves, the $200 billion worth that are sitting in Europe, let alone the $300 billion in total, which are sitting in the world in general, but even the European side of it, about just under $200 billion, if it had that money to spend on the war for the next 2 to 3 years, it would have a fair chance of, if it's prepared to keep on fighting, of buying enough equipment and retraining its armies to push back towards the boundaries of 2022. Whether it could get back all of the territory that it lost in 2014, apart from Crimea, all of the Donbass, in other words, I don't know. The fact is, when defeats begin for the occupying Russian forces, they tend to be cumulative, and so it is possible that the front can roll up quite quickly if an attacking force can do enough damage by way of breaking in, circling round, forcing big units, brigades or whole armies to have to surrender or
be defeated,
leave, be defeated. And then, 2 or 3 armies in a territory then find that they just simply can't carry on because they've lost their flank or whatever it might be. So it's not impossible to imagine, but it would take a lot, and it would need consistent military aid and retraining and re-equipment between now and sometime in 2026. Say up to the autumn next year, or maybe even into 2027, before they could do that. But is it possible that the Ukrainians could push the Russians back significantly in the areas that are now under Russian control? Yes, it is. Yeah. And as I always keep saying, that if Putin started to lose some of the territory that he's taken over the last 3 years, he'd soon get keen on a ceasefire. He'd be really quite interested in ceasefire talks if he thought that he's lost 50% of what he's taken in the last 3 years and might lose the other 50% if he doesn't go for a ceasefire. Then we might be into the realm of talking about an end to this current round of war, which we've said often is still an existential generational struggle. But at least the current war might come to a sort of a semi-permanent ceasefire if the Russians started to lose territory. And that's why I've always said the biggest way of bringing Putin to the table is military defeat of some sort or military losses. Then he'd get interested in negotiations.
Mike, I think it's worth just reminding our viewers as well about that region in the Donbass and the fighting that has been going on there, because these are the areas that Putin says is Russian-speaking. He had sort of proxy forces there that were Ukrainian that were fighting on his side before the full-scale invasion up in 2022.
Correct,
I wonder if he could, the Ukrainians could push back in the northeast around Sumy and all those areas there, push them out there. But that area in the Donbass, it's a different sort of scale of challenge, isn't it?
There is, yeah. The third of the Donbass, so about a third of Luhansk and a third of Donetsk, together, and it's quite a small area on the map if you look at it, those areas have been under Russian militia control since 2014. So they've been over a decade now. And those militias were essentially, they're pro-Russian, but criminal groups, running a sort of highly corrupt mafia-style republics that claimed that they wanted unity with Russia, and of course that's what they got in 2022 as a prelude to the invasion of February 2022. Those areas are so changed by what's happened in the last decade that Ukraine, of course, would want to get them back legally, but it might be better if it didn't immediately, because there'll be more trouble than they're worth. I mean, if Ukraine could push the Russians back to the point where the Russians, and the world felt that the Russians had failed, that they're back towards their 2022 boundaries, if not all the way, that would feel like a victory, and it certainly feel like a victory for the Western powers. Now, we're talking about this casually because of what Trump said last night. The situation on the ground is not going in that direction. It's going very slowly in the opposite direction. But is it feasible? Yes, it is. Could it happen? I don't know. But it is it is within the bounds of the plausible over the next 12 to 15 months if other things lined up in favour of pushing the Russians back to a point where the Ukrainians could say, we'll settle on this for the time being.
Yeah. Let's move on to a question here from Mr. Spitfire. Thank you for this. Nice question. He says, afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for your informative Q&A sessions. My hat tip to Mr. Clarke. From what we've seen over the years, how would you expect Putin to take what Trump has said? Will he see them as a serious threat?
I'm sure the Russians will be looking at this very carefully. They're very good at analysing what's going on in Washington and in Europe in general. I mean, they don't always get the answers right, but they bring every fact to the table. And they'll be watching very, very carefully. And I suspect Putin, I think must be discomforted by what he heard Trump say yesterday. I mean, he must have been quite glad at what Trump said about the UN. I mean, all of that was grist to the Russian mill. I mean, this beating up the UN for everything, from the fact
on its 80th anniversary. All the times to
the elevators didn't work and the teleprompters didn't work. It started like that and got worse. And I think Putin would have enjoyed all of that. And then, then Trump goes away and says something that Putin would not have wanted to hear and would have been quite surprised by, because this is Trump going back on not just the beginning of this presidency, but on the campaign trail. And, I checked last week as a matter of interest that Trump claimed he would end the war in 24 hours. He said it 53 times, according to CNN.
Right, yeah.
And they kept a record. 53 occasions on the campaign trail and as president, he would end this war in 24 hours.
Today.
And so here we are. The Russians will think that Trump will move again and that they can still get on terms with him. But if the Americans are getting out of the war, which they are, they'll be happy about that. And they still seem to believe that they can normalise relations, because they still feel, I think, that their triple strategy is on track. One, to keep fighting the war till they get something out of it. Two, to create a new relationship with the United States, which brings them out of the cold, ends their pariah status. And three, has the effect of splitting NATO, splitting America off from the European allies. And they will feel that they're on track in all of those three directions, even though it's not entirely straightforward and it may not be going as well as they thought it was a couple of months ago.
Just a thought on the sort of the rhetoric of what he said about calling them a paper tiger. It reminds me of what Obama said about Russia, calling them a middling regional power, right?
I hated that,
didn't they?
Yeah.
And we had a response. I mean, could we see something similar from the Russians this time?
Paper tiger goes back to Mao Zedong.
Is that right?
Mao, he always said that Western forces, they're a paper tiger, and that was where the phrase came from. The two great phrases he gave the world. I mean, he was a very strange thinker. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. That was one. And the other one was the West are paper tigers. And everybody loved that phrase, paper tigers. It was a way of patronising and insulting, somebody.
When if Trump knows that he's quoting Mao when he says,
no, I'm sure he did.
Probably not. Well,
if he said, as the great Mao Zedong said, you're a paper tiger. No, he wouldn't know
at the UN as well. All right. Next question then. Let's move on. We're looking at now, Russian airspace violations, the fact that they've been sending drones into NATO airspace since we last spoke. I think there have been, it's been 2 weeks, Michael, so there have been 3 or 4 different instances of the Russians sending not only drones but also aircraft, MiGs, into NATO airspace. So this question is from Paul Leon. He says, if, say, Poland shot down a Russian plane that had breached its airspace, what are the most likely consequences? And I just want to update viewers on what the Poles have said just in the past 24 hours about this. It was Donald Tusk has said that Poland will shoot down enemy aircraft if they violate their airspace. I want to be very clear. We will make a decision to shoot down flying objects without discussion if they violate our territory.
Yeah, that's what he said. Very tough. And also Sikorsky, Polish foreign minister, said at the Security Council, was it yesterday or the day before now? But it was a great quote. He said, I only have one request of the Russian delegate here. He said, next time you send aircraft or drone into our space and we shoot them down, don't come here and whinge about it.
Don't complain
that was my
about
one request. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
So the Poles have taken a very strong view. Other states have been a little bit more equivocal. They've said, we will defend every inch of our airspace. And does that include shooting down? Well, it might. It will depend on the circumstances. But I think Poland, wants to make its position very clear. And, they would have a right. I mean, would want to do it through NATO. But if the NATO command centre, wasn't prepared to do it, they do have the right nationally simply to tell their jets to go and do it. Whether they would or not, whether they would if NATO said no, I'm not sure. But clearly, NATO is on the verge of a very big shift in guidelines, is what they would call it, towards hostile acts and hostile intent.
Yeah.
So they'd say, aircraft coming into NATO airspace is hostile intent. A hostile act would be releasing a weapon. If an aircraft comes in and then fires something, that's hostile act, and then you've got to act against that. So in the future, is NATO going to say, well, aircraft coming into our airspace, we will assume hostile act unless we know differently. We'll start with the assumption it's a hostile act, in which case we'll start with the assumption that we're looking to shoot it down unless we have reasons to desist. And they haven't moved to that yet, not in public, but I think that's the discussion that's going on.
But you can see the dance that's been going on as well, because when the first violation, it was actually a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it, when those 19 drones went into Poland, there was some discussion about whether they were armed, whether they were decoys, and NATO were trying to sort of work out, if it's an armed jet that comes in with, cruise missiles attached to its wing, then that's more of a threat than something that...
Much more, yeah. These were Jabera drones. It turns out almost all of them were, which are the decoy drones that look like the Shahid version, the Jaran 2, as they are now in Russia. And these Jabera drones are, they were decoys. I think all of them were. We're not entirely sure if they all were, but I think all of them were. And they were there to test air defences. But the MiG-31s that encroached on Polish airspace over the Baltic, they didn't... They always say, do they have clean wings? Clean wings means there's nothing hanging underneath, no weapons hanging under the wings or off the fuselage. And they didn't have clean wings. They had air-to-air missiles on.
Yeah, it was Estonian airspace, wasn't it? And it was
Estonia.
And they were... You said Polish.
Oh, sorry, I was Estonian, yeah.
And they... There was some question as well. 'Cause the extraordinary thing, I was working that weekend, the extraordinary thing with that was that the Russians just denied it. They just said it, it didn't happen.
It never happened, yeah.
Michael, how is that possible? To say, it didn't happen.
My client wasn't there, and if he was, he was provoked.
It's incredible.
That's always the defence. No, they start by denying it, and then they bring sort of red herrings to bear. Lots of clutter at the time, and lots of things misinterpreted, and they make the situation look very confusing. This is what they've done when they brought down civilian airliners over. They brought Ukrainian airliners down. And so, first of all, they deny it, and then they make it sound complicated. And then afterwards, they say, well, yes, we did it, but you do it as well.
Well, on that perfect segue, how often do NATO jets fly over Russian airspace?
They don't. If they did, the Russians would make a very big...
I think we would have known about it a lot.
They move towards airspace, but they're very careful not to, which is not to say that there haven't been spy flights in the past. Before satellites were available, back in the 1960s, famously the U-2, Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960, was shot down over the Soviet Union, and the Americans denied it ever existed, and the Russians produced the evidence at the United Nations, really humiliated the United States, and it made the US look very poor. And Gary Powers was held for a while and then released. Big thing. So it has happened. But since the era of satellite monitoring, you don't need to send aircraft over the whole of the Soviet Union. Different things have happened. There was a lot of... They used to send aircraft up, not into Russian airspace, but they used to send aircraft to sniff the air. Up in the Arctic. It happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a pilot got lost and strayed into Soviet airspace because his radars got jammed effectively by the Northern Lights as occurred then. But his job was actually to just sniff the air because they were trying to work out if nuclear tests had been going on. And he went off course on the way back, and the Russians sent MiGs off to intercept him, and the Americans sent aircraft to intercept them, and he eventually ran out of fuel and he glided down. It was a close-run thing, and that was in the middle of the Cuba crisis.
Yeah. It's the clock, Michael, we've got to tick on. It's my fault. I'm asking too many questions. Question here from Richard. I've read speculation, Richard says, from some analysts that Russia's repeated airspace violations are part of a ploy designed to prompt a response from NATO, which Putin can then use as further justification for another round of conscription. How likely do you think that is?
It's a plausible idea that the Russians want to provoke NATO in order to complete their narrative that this war is about defending them against a NATO aggression. So that's plausible, and if they do that, they're playing with fire, because that can go wrong very, very easily. But it's an interesting thing that you raise. There's a lot of rumours and you and I were talking beforehand, and I won't go into details about this because it's not confirmed yet, but that the Russians may be working themselves up to another mobilization. I mean, the last one, the partial mobilization they had in 2022 was very, very unpopular, and Putin immediately backed off, having mobilized 300,000. They backed off doing it again, but they're now at a stage where they may need to create a mobilization, and there looks as if there is some moves afoot to create a sort of pre-mobilization procedures.
Right.
And we'll know a bit more about them probably, say, by the end of this week. I'm watching it very carefully. So mobilization looks as if it might be back on the agenda for Russia, having been off the agenda for the last 3 years. But are these violations part of it? Probably not. Probably not.
But it's just the testing of the fences, as we've been saying. Right, let's move on to a question here. I'm into this one because it's talks about some tech that I know you have some expertise in. It's from Jingly Dave, great name. To combat the swarm of drones coming in from Russia, would a substantial number of laser drone missiles help Ukraine? It says Australian-made laser drones. I mean, I think that the UK has also a program with lasers.
Everyone's got laser programs now, which are becoming fieldable, able to be fielded. And the ground-based laser that we've developed, which was developed first for the Navy, called was a Dragonfire, there's now a ground-based version, and it's being tested effectively in Ukraine. It's a good technology. It's not a whole answer. But for literally, for a couple of pounds a shot, quite literally a couple of pounds a shot, and even more cheaper than that eventually, you can fire lasers at drones and bring them down. But as I keep saying, it's not like James Bond stuff. I mean, drones are less effective on a cloudy day. They're less effective when it's raining. You've got to get a clear line of sight. The laser's got to dwell on the target long enough to put a hole in it, and
it's got to zap it like it's got to actually hold fire.
Yeah. And if it takes 2 seconds to zap it instead of 1 second, then you may not succeed.
The drone's on its way.
Exactly. So lasers are not a complete answer to everything, but the idea of a really cheap weapon that can zap incoming objects in the air accurately is very good. And they seem to be accurate out to a couple of kilometres, kilometre and a half, 2 kilometres, which is plenty if you're on the ground, if you're a unit on the ground fighting, and you've just got to keep away those lasers, those drones. The issue is if you're going to create a big offensive, if you're going to get big forces, combined forces to punch through a front line and really roll up a front in a traditional way, there has to be a method of neutralizing the drone threat long enough to punch through.
Make that space, yeah.
So you've got to be able to take the drone threat down for like 24, 48 hours, and that's your window of opportunity to punch through 20, 30 kilometres and then go back to, if you like, conventional warfighting.
In my head, we're getting towards sort of force field type, where you have to protect a zone, right? Yeah. Where you have to push through, but that is very, very sci-fi in my mind. I'm getting chuckles from the director over there, that idea. But hey, it wasn't too far off.
Not for nothing, Kamali, do they call you Flash Gordon.
Unbelievable. All right. Question here from Andrew, and this is a good one, actually. In a world of disinformation, where does an expert like the good professor go for his reliable information on what's happening?
You go to lots of places. There's not a sense in which you say, oh, I've got my 3 main sources and I stick with them. I do have 3 or 4 main sources, but you don't stick with them. You look at lots and lots of things because you've got to be prepared to challenge what you believe is probably the case. I mean, we're looking at stuff which is anonymous all the time. It's hard to establish, pin it down. You look at it, you think, I think this is the truth, and then you look as wide as a wider range of sources as possible to see what could challenge it. And if the challenges drop away, then that's fine. I always used to say to my students years ago that people who win arguments are usually pretty stupid people, because they usually win arguments for temperamental reasons, because they get angry and everyone else backs away. And then they leave that table thinking that they are intellectually unchallengeable. And of course, they never have to challenge their own material. And so by looking at a range of sources, you must always keep challenging your own material. So it is possible. And I look at lots of official sources. And also, outside my life in Sky, I'm involved in other things which are connected to defence and security and stuff that I do partly relevant with the government, and I end up having lots of conversations. And so you pick up a lot of stuff. And again, what you get from conversations, you've got to check it out.
Yeah.
You end up with lots of material that you're not sure about, but you just keep it jumbling around in your head, and you try and reinforce the things that seem to matter. But you must always look for the counter argument in order to test your own hypothesis.
That's
always test.
Excellent advice, isn't it? Critical thinking. You've got to remain critical
thinking,
and curious about everything that you hear.
Nobody's trying to just build up more evidence that you expect to find. You should look for evidence you would rather not find. And if it's not there, that's fine. But if it is there, you've got to rethink.
Lesson from Professor Clarke there. All right, a couple of quick questions here from the YouTube live chat. Thank you very much for this, Michael. Then we're going to have to wrap it up because we're running short of time. Question here from Ethan Dawson on YouTube. Should NATO create its own private military to send to Ukraine without a flag?
Not NATO, no.
I mean, Coalition of the Willing is getting somewhere.
Yeah, Ukraine can use private contractors in all sorts of ways. But as the Russians have found, if you use too many private contractors, they get out of control. I mean, the Russian war machine was seriously incoherent in 2022-23 because of all the private contractors who were there. I mean, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group was a famous one, but I mean, there were lots of others. So it wouldn't be a sensible idea. But there is always, particularly if there are specific things to do on the domestic front, like security to look after on bases, you want to use private contractors to release as many frontline troops as possible.
Okay.
And if you need to protect the railways and that sort of thing, and if you have private contractors who can help you with the technology, of course, that's sensible. But the issue always with private contractors is keeping control of what they do and making them accountable, not just democratically accountable, but accountable to the general staff who are running the war, so they know who's doing what in what theatres. And the idea of, in a sense, being as underhand as the Russians and sending lots of mercenaries in is not, generally speaking, a good idea. I think.
No.
The Ukrainians know that they've got to fight this war officially on their own with the support, official support of proper NATO countries who are prepared to back them.
You'd want clarity if you were to do that. Okay, Another question here from Max Payne, and I'm into this one because it's very specific on sort of military tactics. If Ukraine were to try large mechanized offensives towards Mariupol in the south, wouldn't it require a very large amount of military equipment as well as air supremacy? And where would this come from?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it would, because Mariupol's right on the Sea of Azov. It would be a good thing to do from the Ukrainian point of view, because it would cut the land bridge. So if you could cut a wide swathe through that land bridge from Zaporizhia to the Sea of Azov, then the Russians would find that their forces were split. And if you split them up, then you can starve one half of them, and that's when you get into a conventional offensive of circling around and forcing one group to have to surrender. So yes, it would be very good if the Ukrainians could do it. What would they need to do? They'd need to set up the sort of offensive that they set up in 2023 that failed, but they'd need to do it better and on a bigger basis, and they're not anywhere near that capability at the moment because they've been having to put everything they've got right onto the front lines. And again, what they've got to do is be able to train a new army, in effect, or several brigades, which is effectively a new army, and train them behind the lines in combined arms warfare, which would be air, ground, artillery, armour, infantry, and then, as we said, deal with the drone threat long enough to punch through in a combined arms way. So, I mean, it can be done. Yes, it could be done, but it would take a lot to do it from where we stand now. And the Ukrainians, I think, will be thinking in those sorts of terms if they think they can carry on this war feasibly for the next 12 months or so.
All right, let's move on to a final question here, and it's from Jimmy. Thank you for this. Would China step in to help Russia if Russia were to be seen to be losing the war, in your view?
Yeah, good question. The Chinese decided quite early on that they didn't want the Russians to lose this war. But what losing means is a matter of degree. If the Russians were losing territory and were moving towards a ceasefire to retain some of their gains, if the Ukrainians got on the front foot again, would the Chinese, really move in to stop that happening? No, probably not. They'd probably then say to Putin, take what gains you've got. I mean, this has gone far enough. You can't do any more of this. The Chinese like the idea that this war goes on because it's good for them that this war goes on in all sorts of ways I won't go into. There isn't time. But they want to carry on. They want the war to carry on. But if the Russians were losing as it were, the tactical battle. I'm not sure the Chinese would stick their necks out for that. But they don't want them to lose strategically. They don't want Putin to fall because of this, or for the whole Russian position to collapse and a revolution to take place in Russia. They see that as destabilizing. So they want to prevent that if they could.
So status quo is their best thing at the moment?
They go for status quo, but they won't stick their neck out too far for Putin.
Interesting. All right, Professor Clarke, let's wrap it up there, because you've got stuff to do. You've got to be on telly in a little while, Michael, I think. Yeah. So I'll let you go. Thank you all for submitting your questions and submitting them as we were going along. I hope we got to most of them. And I think our diaries will align, so we'll be able to do this again at a similar time next week. Thank you for being with us. See you again soon.